In 1939, Germany was already preparing for war. Private car production was being restricted. Factories were being filled with military orders. Aircraft engines, trucks and weapons were taking priority. And yet, inside Mercedes-Benz, the racing department was busier than ever. This is the strange story of the year Nazi Germany kept racing while Europe moved toward catastrophe. A year of silver arrows, speed records, propaganda victories, deadly crashes, and one final race held after the war had already begun. The country was on a war footing, and the state had made military production the priority. Private car production was severely limited. The Munich Agreement of September 1938 had delayed the outbreak of war, but it had not ended the crisis. Hitler used the extra time to prepare. Dr. Wilhelm Kissel, chairman of Daimler-Benz, said the company's factories were fully occupied with army and state orders. That should have meant less racing, not more, but surviving Daimler-Benz film from the period shows the opposite. The racing department was still developing cars, engines, and record machines at a frantic pace. To the Nazi leadership, motor racing was not a luxury. It was public proof that German engineering was superior. A Grand Prix victory could become propaganda. A speed record could become a political message. A silver racing car could be treated almost like a weapon of prestige. The timeline begins in Germany, early 1939. Mercedes and Auto Union are still racing. Europe is still officially at peace, but the road to war is already open. The question is obvious. If Germany was preparing for war, why keep spending money on racing cars? The answer is that motor racing had become part of the regime's image of itself. Hitler and the Nazi leadership wanted Germany to look modern, technical, and unstoppable. Racing gave them that image in a form people could see and hear. The cars were fast, loud, and spectacular. They did not need speeches to communicate power. The silver arrows were especially useful because they seemed to prove that German industry could outthink and outbuild everyone else. Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union were not just private racing teams in the ordinary sense. They were symbols of national prestige. Their rivalry was real, and their engineering was extraordinary, but the political system around them made every victory larger than sport. When German cars defeated French, Italian, or British rivals, newspapers and newsreels could frame it as more than a race. It became a demonstration of German skill, discipline, and technological destiny. This is what makes the 1939 season so strange. While the country's industry was turning toward war, the racing teams were still treated as important. The same culture of engineering that produced racing engines was also being pulled deeper into aircraft engines and military production. Motorsport and militarization were not the same thing, but in 1939, they were being pushed into the same national story. By 1939, German Grand Prix racing was dominated by two giants. Mercedes-Benz represented deep tradition, enormous resources, and the technical discipline of Unterdurkheim. Auto Union represented a more radical idea. Its Grand Prix cars used a rear engine layout, something that looked exotic and dangerous in the 1930s. The Auto Unions were difficult to master, but in the right hands, they were devastating. The rivalry had already produced legends. Rudolf Caracciola was the great Mercedes master, famous for his control in rain and terrible conditions. Hermann Lang was the former mechanic who had risen into the front rank of drivers. Manfred von Brauchitsch was fast, emotional, and dramatic. At Auto Union, the shadow of Bernd Rosemeyer still hung over the team. Rosemeyer had been killed in January 1938 while attempting to answer a Mercedes speed record on the Autobahn. By 1939, Tazio Nuvolari, the small Italian genius, had become Auto Union's most dangerous weapon. This rivalry gave the season its tension. Mercedes wanted to defend its supremacy. Auto Union wanted to break it. Both teams were funded, filmed, and watched by a regime that expected German machines to dominate. But 1939 would not unfold like a clean victory parade. It would become a season of brilliance, mechanical failure, rain, death, and a final race held at the edge of war. The Mercedes W154 was not a new concept in 1939, but it was being heavily developed. The 1938 cars had already proved fast, yet Mercedes' new speed alone would not be enough. 19 of the 1938 engines were still serviceable, but new engines were needed for the new season. The company wanted more reliability, better power delivery, and improved aerodynamics. The experimental department became a huge operation, with hundreds of men working around the racing program. The heart of the work was the 3-liter V12. Mercedes engineers focused on the intake side of the engine and on the supercharging system. The earlier arrangement had used 2 single-stage compressors. The revised concept used a single 2-stage compressor system, reducing the power absorbed by the compressor and improving efficiency. In practice, that meant more usable power and a flatter torque curve. The engine could deliver its strength across a wider range instead of only at the very top. This was not casual tinkering. It was advanced engineering under pressure. The W154 also lost weight compared with the previous season, with changes to the chassis and suspension. The fuel system was refined so that the car's handling did not change as dramatically as the tank emptied. This mattered because these cars carried enormous quantities of special fuel. At racing speed, fuel consumption could be extreme, and a Grand Prix could be won or lost in how the car behaved as its weight changed. In other words, Mercedes was not coasting into 1939. It was pushing harder. At the exact moment when Germany's factories were being pulled toward war, one of its most famous manufacturers was still perfecting the racing car. Before the Grand Prix season truly took shape, Mercedes returned to the Autobahn. The famous record of 1938 had already made Rudolf Caracciola a legend. In a Mercedes record car on the Frankfurt to Darmstadt motorway, he had driven at more than 270 miles per hour, the highest speed ever recorded on a public road. In February 1939, the record program continued on a stretch of motorway near Dessau. Mercedes brought 2 3-liter record cars built for Class D international records. These were not ordinary Grand Prix cars. They were streamlined machines, shaped for speed rather than wheel-to-wheel racing. One had individually streamlined wheels for standing start records. The other wore a fully streamlined body for flying start runs. Caracciola broke several records. On one run with the fully streamlined car, he reached an average of 399.6 kilometers per hour over the flying mile. That is roughly 248 miles per hour. The number matters, but the setting matters even more. These speeds were being pursued not on American salt flats, but on German motorway concrete. The regime wanted the world to see the Autobahn as a modern stage for German engineering. The transcript calls this the fastest ever driver on a public road. Historically, Caracciola's 1938 speed remains the central public road legend, while the 1939 Dessau runs added new class records. For the video, the key point is this. In the months before war, Nazi Germany was still using public roads as a theater of speed. The motorway records were not the end of the dream. Mercedes was also working on something even more extreme, the T80 record car. This was not a Grand Prix car adapted for record runs. It was a purpose-built land speed machine designed by Ferdinand Porsche and intended to use a massive Daimler-Benz aircraft engine. The idea was to bring the absolute land speed record to German soil. The T80 was meant to be a spectacle. It had 3 axles, a long streamlined body, and the power of an aircraft engine placed into a road vehicle. It was supposed to run on a specially prepared stretch of the Autobahn near Dessau during a German record week planned for 1940. This would have been more than an engineering attempt. It would have been a public ritual of speed, staged for national pride. But the timing was fatal. By the time the machine was close to completion, Europe was already moving into war. What had been imagined as a triumphant speed week became impossible. The car that was supposed to prove Germany's dominance never made its record run. The dream of ultimate speed was swallowed by the reality of military conflict. This is one of the strange themes of 1939. The racing world was still imagining future spectacles. The political world was already preparing disasters. The first major Grand Prix drama of 1939 came far from Germany, in North Africa. Tripoli was then part of the Italian colonial empire in Libya. The Tripoli Grand Prix was one of the richest races in the world, made famous by its state lottery and known as the Race of Millions. For 4 years, German cars had dominated it. That created a problem for the Italians. Tripoli was supposed to show the prestige of fascist Italy, but Mercedes kept turning it into a German victory parade. For 1939, the Italians changed the rules. Instead of allowing the usual 3-liter Grand Prix cars, the race was restricted to 1.5-liter Voiturette machines, a class where Italian manufacturers like Alfa Romeo and Maserati were expected to be strong. On paper, it looked like Mercedes had been excluded. In reality, Mercedes had prepared a surprise. In complete secrecy, the company built 2 small racing cars called the W165. They looked like miniature silver arrows, but they were serious machines. Mercedes had taken the political insult of being pushed out of Tripoli and answered it with engineering. The cars were finished under enormous time pressure, shipped to North Africa, and prepared for a race the Italians had tried to make unwinnable for Germany. When the race began on May 7, 1939, Hermann Lang seized the lead. Rudolf Caracciola followed. The Italian cars could not stop them. Lang won, Caracciola finished second, and Luigi Villorsi's Alfa Romeo came third, several minutes behind. The W165 never raced again, but in its only race, it achieved exactly what Mercedes wanted. It turned an Italian rule change into a German humiliation of the field. From Stuttgart to Tripoli, the Silver Arrows had crossed the Mediterranean and turned a rule change into one of the most astonishing surprises of the season. 2 weeks after Tripoli, the new 1939 Mercedes W154 faced its first major German test at the Eiffel race on the Nürburgring. The date was May 21, 1939. The Nürburgring was not just another circuit. It was one of the most demanding racing roads in the world, a long ribbon of tarmac through the Eiffel Mountains, with corners, crests, drops, and weather that could change the character of a race in minutes. This was where Mercedes and Auto Union could measure themselves properly. The Mercedes cars of Hermann Lang and Hans-Hugo Hartmann used the new 2-stage compressor system, while Caracciola and von Brauchitsch still used older arrangements. The result was a clear sign of where Mercedes had found its advantage. Lang won the race after 10 laps. Tazio Nuvolari followed in the Auto Union Type D, roughly 11 seconds behind. Caracciola and von Brauchitsch completed the Mercedes result in third and fourth. It was not just a victory, it was confirmation. The new Mercedes engine concept worked. Lang was now more than a former mechanic who had become useful to the team. He was becoming the strongest Mercedes driver of the year. The 1939 season was beginning to take shape around him. The Belgian Grand Prix at Spa on June 25 was the first round of the European Championship. Spa was fast, dangerous, and unforgiving even in good weather. In 1939, it was run in pouring rain. The race became a test of courage and judgment, the kind of race where Caracciola's old reputation as the rain master would normally matter. But the central tragedy of the day belonged to Richard Seaman. Seaman was the British driver in the Mercedes team. In 1938, he had won the German Grand Prix, an achievement that made him one of the most remarkable foreign drivers ever to race for Mercedes. At Spa in 1939, he drove brilliantly and took the lead. But while leading in the rain, he crashed. His Mercedes was badly damaged and caught fire. Seaman was taken to hospital and died from his injuries that night. Lang won the race, ahead of Rudolf Haas in an Auto Union and von Brauchitsch in a Mercedes. On paper, it was another Mercedes victory. In reality, it was one of the darkest days of the Silver Arrows era. The cars had become faster, the teams more sophisticated, and the politics more intense, but the danger had never disappeared. In 1939, death still sat beside the glamour of Grand Prix racing. The next European Championship round was the French Grand Prix at Reims on July 9. If Tripoli had been a Mercedes humiliation of Italy, Reims became an Auto Union answer to Mercedes. The fast French circuit should have suited the silver arrows, but the race became a failure for Stuttgart. The Mercedes cars suffered. Caracciola went out early after leaving the road. Von Brauchitsch and Lang were stopped by engine trouble. None of the three W154s completed the full distance. Auto Union took advantage, and Hermann Paul Müller won, with Georg Meyer second. It was a powerful reminder that the 1939 season was not a one-team walkover. This mattered because the European Championship was becoming complicated. Under the older points logic, Müller was building a serious claim. Under a more modern style of scoring, Lang's victories made him look like the season's dominant driver. The official championship would never be properly settled by the international authorities because war intervened. But in the summer of 1939, the Mercedes versus Auto Union fight was still alive. The Swiss Grand Prix at Bremgarten on August 20 was the final European Championship race of 1939. Bremgarten was beautiful, fast, and dangerous, a road circuit through forest roads near Bern. In wet conditions, it became especially risky. Mercedes brought 4 cars. Auto Union brought 4 cars. The championship question was still unresolved. The race became another Mercedes success. Lang won in the wet after a hard fight with Caracciola, finishing only a few seconds ahead. Von Brauchitsch completed the Mercedes result in third. It looked like the perfect response to Reims and a fitting close to the championship season. But the championship itself remained historically messy. The AIACR, the International Racing Authority, never officially published a final championship table because the war interrupted everything. Under the old minimum points system, Hermann Paul Müller had a strong claim. Under a newer style of scoring, Hermann Lang looked like the rightful champion because of his overall success. Later, Nazi motorsport chief Adolf Hitler declared Lang the European champion. That declaration gave Lang the title in the German telling of the story, but historically it remains disputed. This dispute actually fits the year. Even the championship could not end cleanly. The season had too much politics, too much confusion, and too little time left before war swallowed the sport. The Nazi sports organization also arranged for the 1939 German Hill Climb Championship to be decided on Austrian roads. This mattered politically because Austria had been annexed by Germany in 1938. A hill climb in the Austrian Alps could therefore be used to underline the idea that Austria had been absorbed into a greater Germany. The most dramatic event was the Grossglockner Hill Climb on August 6, 1939. The road climbed through the Alps with steep gradients, narrow corners, and dangerous drops. It was a very different challenge from Nürburgring or Tripoli. A Grand Prix car on a circuit needed high speed, balance, and endurance. A hill climb car needed traction, torque, bravery, and precision. Mercedes prepared special cars for Hermann Lang and Manfred von Brauchitsch. They could use the more powerful, older W125 machines, adapted for mountain work. The drivers were offered twin rear wheels for extra traction, but the road was narrow and the corners sharp, so the choice was difficult. The cars used special cooling arrangements to reduce weight and cope with the climb. Steam could be seen as the engines were cooled. The weather became part of the story. Rain and mist rolled down the mountain. Visibility dropped. Conditions worsened as the cars climbed higher. Hands stuck. The great Auto Union hill climb specialist had been the mountain king. But this time Lang beat him. Mercedes won the race, and Lang became German hill climb champion for racing cars. This was another 1939 image that feels almost unreal in hindsight. In early August, with war only weeks away, German racing teams were still sending silver arrows up Alpine roads for film crews, prestige, and political meaning. By late August, the racing calendar was still moving, but Europe was already on the edge. The next stop would be Belgrade, and by then, war would no longer be a threat, it would be reality. Last race of the Silver Arrows era was held on the streets of Belgrade in Yugoslavia. The date was September 3, 1939. Germany had invaded Poland on September 1. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, the same day as the race. The Mercedes and Auto Union teams were already in Belgrade. In any normal world, the race might have been cancelled, but the Germans were ordered to stay and race. Hohenlein wanted a demonstration of German expertise. The field was thin. The only real opposition outside the German teams came from a much slower Bugatti. The event became a strange and almost grotesque spectacle, silver arrows screaming over cobbled streets while Europe entered the Second World War. Von Brauchitsch had been fastest in practice and led from the start, with Lang close behind. The street circuit was slippery and dangerous. Von Brauchitsch drove brilliantly, but the race became chaotic. Lang retired after a stone shattered his goggles and glass injured his eye. Von Brauchitsch then overdid it and spun. Auto Union took over. For a time, it looked like a certain Auto Union victory. Then tire trouble and pit stops brought Von Brauchitsch back into the fight. He closed to within seconds of WWII. This was not the image the Nazi sports officials wanted, the last great German racing spectacle being stolen by a small Italian driving for Auto Union. But that is exactly what happened. Tazio WWII won. The last race of the Silver Arrows before the war ended with a German car winning, but not with a German driver. WWII, one of the greatest racers of all time, gave Auto Union its final triumph. It was the perfect ending because it was not clean, not obedient, and not easy to turn into simple propaganda. The world of Grand Prix racing had reached its final pre-war moment. Then the engines fell silent. Looking back, 1939 had been a Mercedes year in many ways. Lang had been the dominant driver across the season. He won at Pau, Tripoli, the Eiffel Race, Belgium and Switzerland, and he took the mountain title as well. Caracciola had added the German Grand Prix, a final great victory at the Nürburgring. Mercedes had introduced new engine developments, improved the W154, and built one of the most successful small racing cars of the era in the W165. But the season was not simple. Auto Union had won at Reims with Müller and at Belgrade with WWII. Müller had a genuine championship argument under the older point system. WWII's final win meant the last word did not belong to Mercedes. Siemens' death at Spa showed the cost of the sport. The T80 showed how far speed dreams could go before war stopped them, and the disputed championship showed how even results could become political. That is why 1939 works as a documentary timeline. It is not just a list of races. It is a story of a sport continuing past the point where history had already changed. In January and February, record cars were still on the Autobahn. In May, Mercedes was humiliating Italy in Tripoli. In June and July, the Nürburgring and Spa were still filled with crowds and film crews. In August, the Silver Arrows were climbing Austrian mountains. In September, they were racing through Belgrade as war began. The year starts with speed. It ends with silence. The final turn in the story is industrial. Daimler-Benz had been a racing company, but by 1939, it was also deeply tied to the military machine. The DB601 aircraft engine became one of the most important German engines of the war. It powered aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Bf 110. It used direct fuel injection and variable speed supercharging, and it was part of a larger family of Daimler-Benz aircraft engines developed during the 1930s and war years. The works at Unterdurkheim, where racing cars had been developed, became important for aircraft engine work. The same company that built silver Grand Prix machines was now producing the technology of air war. This does not mean a racing car and a fighter engine were the same machine. But it does mean the boundary between motorsport engineering and military production became harder to separate in 1939. There was also a human cost. Daimler-Benz later acknowledged its links to the Nazi regime. During the war, the company used forced laborers, prisoners of war and concentration camp detainees. By 1944, almost half of its workforce consisted of civilian forced laborers, prisoners of war or concentration camp detainees. That history belongs at the end of this story because it changes how we look back at the beauty of the machines. The Silver Arrows were extraordinary, the drivers were brave, the engineering was world-class, but the system around them was brutal. In 1939, the racetrack and the battlefield were not yet the same place, but they were being pulled into the same national project. The 1939 racing season was the last year of the old Silver Arrow's world. It began with record cars on German motorways and ended with Grand Prix machines racing through Belgrade after the invasion of Poland. Mercedes had built faster engines, sharper cars, and a secret miniature racer that conquered Tripoli. Auto Union had answered with Müller and Nuvolari. Lang had risen from former mechanic to the dominant driver of the year. Caracciola had produced one final Nürburgring masterpiece, but history had overtaken the sport. The race cars were stored away. The factories changed purpose. The circuits went quiet. The men who had spent the 1930s chasing speed now lived in a Europe at war. That is why 1939 is more than a racing season. It is a timeline of contradiction. It shows a regime preparing for destruction while still staging spectacles of modernity. It shows engineering brilliance inside a political system of violence. It shows the final flash of the silver arrows before the world that created them disappeared. In 1939, Nazi Germany was racing to war, and the silver arrows got there first.